Good evening. My name is Latika Gupta, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation, where I work as Director Projects. Many of you know the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation, or SSAF, was founded by Vivan Sundaram and his sister Navina Sundaram in 2016. Since its inception, the foundation has supported artistic and cultural practice that deals with historical memory, with a view towards futurities based on secular principles and freedom of expression. And it's these principles that form the bedrock of our work that extends across a series of grants that support art practice and research. Publications, we have an imprint, SSAF Tulika Books, our co-publishing initiative with Tulika Books, and the 5 titles that we've published so far can be seen at the desk outside. We organize workshops, lectures, symposia, and part of our work is also to incubate and support discursive, processual, and experimental strategies of practice through the SSAF lab. And I encourage you to visit our website, ssaf.in, to learn more about all these programs. In curating and supporting the arts and cultural practices in plural and expanded forms, in a world that has been made precarious by severe ecological destruction, increasing militarization, hardening fundamentalist positions, and growing inequities, we ask, what can the arts do? What forms can political aesthetics take, and how might a rhizomatic approach to making and doing build generative collaborations and also resilient, hospitable spaces for interdisciplinary and progressive forms of cultural and artistic inquiries? One of the major grants that SSAF makes is to support installation art. The grant, formerly known as the SSAF Installation Art Grant and established in 2019, has been reinstituted as the Vivan Sundaram Grant for Installation Art in 2024. Vivan trained at the Faculty of Fine Arts, MS University in Baroda in painting from 1961 to 65, and then at the Slade School of Art in London from 66 to 1969. And from the early 1990s, he moved from painting to installations that combine sculpture, photography, video, found material, and performance. Most notable amongst these are Memorial, which sort of evolved from 1993 to 2014 and had its most recent iteration and display at the Tanks at the Tate Modern. And this was a direct response to the communal violence in Bombay against Muslims. And a monumental site-specific installation, which is now known as History Project at the Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta in 1998. And the image that you see on the screen is of Vivan climbing up to the dome of the hall in 1998 in Calcutta. In Trash, 2008, Vivan created an urbanscape composed of garbage. In 2015, he collaborated with theater makers Anuradha Kapoor and Shantanu Bose on 409 Ramkinkars, on the artist Ramkinkar Bej. And Meanings of Failed Action, Insurrection 1946 in 2017, on the uprising of the Royal Indian Navy and Bombay's working class that was co-authored with Ashish Rajadhaksh and David Chapman. The grant is premised on the fact that Indian art has been energized since the 1990s by what is broadly termed installation art, but that there has been limited infrastructural and institutional support for projects such as this. This is the 3rd iteration of the grant, which began in 2019 with a full-day seminar titled Installation Art Spatial Constructs, which practitioners, curators, and theorists, many of whom are here in the audience today, interrogating the vocabularies and possibilities of what installation art is or can be. Drawing from the seminar, an abbreviated set of propositions was proffered by Vivan Sundaram and critic and curator Geeta Kapur towards the formulation of the grant, and this is what we include in our call for applications as well. And I quote, "Installations foreground material structures, sometimes articulated as object configurations and dispersed fragments, and at other times architecturally. Within the parameters of the concept and term, an installation may construct a mise-en-scène for sculptural staging. It may preserve archival, photographic, and documentary data for conceptual and pedagogical purposes. It may succeed in imagining community and also provoking social action. On an other plane, an installation may create a fluid spatiality, a phenomenology for heightened affect. This may entail additional use of film and video, multimedia, including computer-generated fictions, kinetic forms, light, sensors, and sonic elements, technologies designed to draw the spectator into an immersive and interactive environment. Installation projects are often contextual. In select instances, when the elements deployed are inalienable from the selected site, whether a warehouse, museum, a landscape, or ruin, an installation may be considered to be site-specific. This is a distinctive feature of installation art, but for the grant, we consider it neither definitional, nor is it a mandatory condition to apply for the grant then. The grant supports the making of a new work of installation art by an Indian individual artist or artist collective with an amount of rupees 8 lakhs. This year, in 2024, more than 90 applications were received from across India. And the jury deliberated and discussed these proposals over 3 days to select the 2024 grantee. The jury members for this year are Charles Esche, who was the chair of the jury, Nancy Adajania, and Geeta Kapur. To introduce the jury, Charles Esche is director of the Van Abbemuseum Eindhoven and professor of contemporary art and curating at the University of the Arts, London. He's an advisor at the Jan Vack Academy, Maastricht, and board member of the ZKM in Stuttgart. He's co-convener of the Democracy Pavilion and School of Common Knowledge. He received the 2012 Princess Margaret Award and the 2014 CCS Bard College Prize for Curatorial Excellence. Among many international exhibitions, he's co-curated The Meeting That Never Was in 2022 at the Abbemuseum Vilnius, Power and Other Things at the Europalia Beaux-Arts in 2017, Art Turns, Word Turns in Jakarta in 2017, How to Talk About the Things That Don't Exist, the 31st Sao Paulo Biennale in 2014, Ideal for Living in 2011, and the Riwak Biennale in Palestine in 2007 and 2009, the Istanbul Biennale in 2005, and Gwangju in 2002. His latest publication is Art and Its Worlds, After All, and Koenig Press in 2021. And he's writing a book on demodern thinking with Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti to be published by Duke University Press in 2025. Next month, Soils, an exhibition that he's curating about art, material, and belonging, opens at the Van Abbemuseum. Nancy Adajania is a cultural theorist and curator based in Bombay. She was joint artistic director of the 9th Gwangju Biennale in South Korea in 2012. She's curated a number of exhibitions, including most recently, the path-breaking Woman is as Woman Does at the CS-MVS Museum with the Jahangir Nicholson Arts Foundation in 2022. That was the first ever intergenerational mapping of the work of Indian women artists, filmmakers, and activists against the backdrop of the women's movement in India. Other major research-based exhibitions include retrospectives of artists Navjot Altaf, Sudhir Patwardhan, Meli Gobai, and Nelly Setna. Adajania has proposed several new theoretical models through her extensive writings on subaltern art, media art, public art, collaborative art, transcultural art, and biennale culture in the global south. For over 20 years, she's written on the practices of women artists of several generations by deploying a transdisciplinary approach that melds art history, feminist theory, anthropology, activism, and philosophy. Shilpa Gupta, as all of you know, is an artist, and her work probes how people and the experiences are formed by places, objects, and via processes of classification, limitation, and censorship. She's had solo shows at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, the Woerleiden Museum, the Barbican in London, Amant in New York, and Biennale participations include Venice, Berlin, Kochi, Lyon, Gwangju, Sharjah, Havana, and Yokohama, and Liverpool, amongst others. Her work has been shown at the Serpentine Gallery, at MoMA, at KNMA, and is in the collection of the Guggenheim Museum, Tate, Centre Pompidou, Maury Museum, Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, amongst others. And in 2024, she's going to have a solo in Santander. Now, the SSAF grants program, the 3 grants that we have, is envisaged as extending beyond just financial support. And we look to open up a discursive field, looking at transnational entanglements in art history and practice. Thus, an annual lecture by the jury chairperson of each of our grants is an important part of our annual events calendar. This evening, we will begin with a lecture by Charles Esche, chaired by Geeta Kapur. I've already introduced Charles, and this audience doesn't really need an introduction to Geeta, but I'll still do a formal one. Geeta is a Delhi-based critic and curator, and her books include Contemporary Indian Artists, 1978, When Was Modernism? Essays on Contemporary Cultural Practice in India in 2000, and Critics' Compass, Navigating Practice, which is forthcoming very soon. Her curatorial work includes an exhibition co-curated at the Royal Academy of Art in 1982, a rehang of the NGMA in Delhi in 1994, Dispossession at the Johannesburg Biennale in 95, Bombay-Mumbai Century City co-curated with Ashish Rajadaksh at the Tate Modern 2001, Subterrane at the House of World Cultures Berlin 2003, Aesthetic Bind 5 exhibitions at the Kimol Press Court across 2013 and 14. She's been a jury member for the Biennales of Venice, Dakar, and Sharjah. She was one of the founder editors of Journal of Arts and Ideas, an advisory board member of Third Text, and a trustee and advisory editor of Marg. She's been an advisory member of the Asian Art Council, the Guggenheim Museum, Asia Tate Research Center, Asia Art Archive, Hong Kong. She's a trustee of SSAF and also the series editor of Art Documents, a series published by SSAF Tulika Books. So Charles's lecture will be followed by a discussion with Geeta and questions from the audience.
I'm just going to say 2 lines before Charles's lecture, and I have something a little more dialogic with Charles after his lecture, and then we will open the house for question and answer. And I expect there'll be a lot of that from the thematic that Charles has chosen to speak on. I've known Charles since 2005, which is a very long time, and we met at Sharjah, and then we met again at Sharjah as part of a jury that we worked together on for the Sharjah Biennale. Other encounters over these many years, and a direct debate in 2017 at a conference of European International Museum Federation at Van Abbemuseum, with where Charles is, as you have been told, the director. Charles' lecture is titled, as you have already seen, The Life of Installation as a Decolonizing Possibility. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Latika and Geeta, for the opportunity to come to Delhi for what I'm ashamed to say is the first time. I'm nearly 60, well, I am 60, but I haven't made it here before, but I hope that this will be the first of many visits and of projects and conversations that we can continue into the future. I really enjoyed the company of my fellow jurists, of which Nancy is still here and Shilpa has sadly gone. And I think it was a really stimulating opportunity for me to think about this question of installation, which is what is at the core of the award. And what might installation mean? And I have to say it's something that I hadn't thought about for some time. And that also is always an interesting trigger, no? To think about where you are now and then to be provoked, as Geeta kindly did, to think about something different and something new. And in a sense, what I'm going to do is try and align my concerns, my thinking, with the question of installation that is before us today and will be recognized in the award which Nancy will elegantly give in hopefully in about 40 minutes time, but you never know with me, I'm afraid. I think it's important in this short time, I can't go into a full understanding of my position, but it's important to say that, as in the biography, I'm coming from Northwest Europe. My ancestors are German, my upbringing was English, and I'm a Dutch citizen. So a very small corner of the world. The problem, a little bit, which is also in the title, is that that small corner of the world has been responsible for the whole colonial project, which I would date back 500 years to the original journey of Columbus to America, or to the New World, as it was referred to then. This carries a certain responsibility, and today, in a globalized context, in a context which we can call a decolonized context, but the extent to which that has actually been achieved is, of course, very much an open question. We can call a postmodern context, but the extent to which we really have left the modern is, again, another question that I think we need to ask. But nevertheless, it's a context which needs to become much more specific than it has often been in the past. And so that specificity of coming from Northwest Europe, I think, is a means, at least as far as I have tested it out so far, to have a dialogue with other parts of the world, to understand that coming from somewhere, not hiding, not necessarily feeling guilty, although that's easy enough, God knows, but actually stating that this is the position, and then seeing what other positions, which are different, can speak together with my position. And that's very much what it's at the core, I think, of the practice that I've been engaged in for the past, I would say, 15 years or so, when I switched really from a sort of Marxist analysis, which I would see now as a very universalizing analysis, towards something which recognized these differences, but didn't recognize these differences as incapable of building coalition, of building allegiance, of building relation, but nevertheless recognized and respected difference. And so that's the core of where I'm coming from. I'm also coming from a practice which is curatorial. Also, it's not theoretical as such, though it touches on theory. It's not artistic as such, though it touches on the conditions of the artist. It's not bureaucratic as such, though it often touches on the conditions of the bureaucrat. So this question of the curatorial is something which is placed between fields, while also trying to claim its own field. It's an awkward in-betweenness, but perhaps it's an appropriate position to come from. But it also means that in thinking about these larger questions which I've situated, the question of coloniality, the question of positionality, the question of relationality, in positioning these things, it comes through a question of material. Anyway, a question of what material might allow us to speak, or how it might allow us to speak, rather than how abstraction might allow us to speak. And through that, we can reach maybe the same goals, but we can reach it through a different route. And I think that's what the curatorial can bring. So I'm going to try, in addressing this subject today of installation, to try and speak through the materiality of certain installations by artists, and then exhibitions by curators, and seeing what those relationships might be, and then ending by maybe talking a little bit more about the question of the decolonial, but I hope that's also something that we can address with Geeta, the decolonial and the demodern, which is a position that I feel I want to try and defend from within my own positionality, into a discussion with you all. I'm going to try and keep it short, but I already realize I'm running late. So let me start by acknowledging and recognizing this project, which Latika already mentioned, but I think it's important in the context of this talk and in the context of our dearly departed Vivan Sundaram, who's still much missed, to recognize that certainly here in India, we cannot talk about installation without understanding his contribution, his definitional contribution to this question of the installation. And this is a work that I picked because I haven't had the opportunity, as I said, it's my first time, so I haven't had the opportunity to see this in real life. It's now from 1998, so I'm not sure how many of us have had the opportunity to see it. So it survives in a way in these photographs, in these images. But what I think is important is to recognize this project as part of the discourse which I'm talking about, without presuming to go into it as a project in itself, but to understand that this dialogue with history, this dialogue with material, this dialogue with place, this dialogue with memory, which is what this work sets up, is very much the same kinds of dialogues that might be thought about in the works that I'm going to talk about. So I won't say any more about this, but I think it's important to mention it. the other preface, if you like, to getting into the putting my hands in the soil of the installations that I'm going to speak about, is simply to recognize where we are today and what we are faced with in the complicity of my people, my tradition, as well as the complicity of many others, with the current genocide that's happening in Palestine. And I think it's very important for us to remember this. I put this up because this is part of a long project which I've been involved in with the Internationale, which is our museum confederation of European museums from Istanbul to Dublin, actually. Jumping over these days the United Kingdom, as you know, which is no longer in Europe and is disinterested in a dialogue with Europe also on a cultural level, I have to say. Having been my former home, it's a bit upsetting, but it's the reality of our condition. So this is a project that we've done where we work together with Palestinian intellectuals, artists, writers, and put together 2 series of 24-hour podcasts, which are quite extraordinary. And I would, if you wanted to, take a note of the link or go to internationaleonline.org and see the voices of Palestine. One of the essays that we commissioned by Francois Berger talked about Palestine being the center of the world today. And certainly if I come from a place which for long claimed that status, it now very necessarily, I think, shifts towards the Palestinian condition at this moment. And we need to be aware of that. So I'm going to start now by talking about a number of installations, 2 in particular in detail, and then we'll move on to the curatorial. I'm going to talk about Anna Boghiguian's installation called The Salt Traders, which was originally presented in the Greek School in the Istanbul Biennale in 2015, and then had a strong afterlife, which I will talk about. And then I'm going to talk about a project that Sheela Gowda made for the São Paulo Biennale, which we put together in 2014. An interesting project, I think, one that we'll see in a minute, that touches on many of the questions that are raised by what installation is. And I think what's interesting about these 2 projects is that they draw their strength, their groundedness, their sense of where they might speak to and what they might speak of from material. In the one case, salt, in the other case, rubber. So they talk about these raw materials, how these materials can affect the narrative, can affect the conditions in which we can speak about the social, the political, the economic, the relation at the geopolitical level. Can be talked about through materiality rather than through an abstraction, which then artists attempt perhaps to illustrate in some ways, which can be an issue around art, but that's not the art that I'm talking about today. I'll say a little bit about this because I think this is less well known, and then I think Sheela's work is much more well known to you as an audience, so we can skip the introduction a little bit to that. So Anna Boghiguian is an Egyptian artist of Armenian roots. You can see that in the name. An artist who has been working all her life, essentially, based in Cairo, but often traveling, has this kind of peripatetic existence of the artist, and yet still comes back to Cairo as a place which draws so much of her inspiration from, but also understands Cairo as being in relation with so many other parts, with so many other stories, which is befitting to her Armenian roots, but befitting also to the sense of a geography which is not the geography of modernity necessarily, a geography which centers itself around the story of civilization, as Kenneth Clark once outlined for us on a BBC journal book in the 1990, a book and a series actually, in the 1960s, but more around the questions of the Ottoman Empire and the historic civilizations which occupy the Mediterranean. So this is her starting point, her ground, her soil, in which she needs to nurture in order to be nurtured by it, in the words of Munir Fashe, a Palestinian thinker, also part of this Mediterranean position. So the work itself is a speculative story about this historical commodity. It is made of painted soils, of collages, honeycombs, sections of a boat, and a history of salt. It is inspired by the commerce and the history that surrounds her place, but also goes much wider. Looking at the idea of salt in the Roman Empire, but also looking at how salt has had meanings throughout the world. It's interesting that the origin of the term salary, which is an important one for all of us, I think, comes from salarium, which is the salt distribution in the Roman Empire. So actually we have a vested interest in this material of salt because it's something that keeps us fed. And obviously bread and salt is what you bring in a German history, in a German tradition. If you buy or move into a new house, the first thing that is brought is bread and salt, in order to say that the house should always have bread and salt with it throughout your occupation of that land. Also, of course, it would be foolish of me to not think about the Salt March and Gandhi's campaign, pacifist, I suppose we could say, campaign. That's probably the wrong word, and forgive me if it is. But the Salt March also becoming, again, the quality of this material being so significant that it can have these political, these economic consequences around it. And this is really what she is referring to. Also, salt as an idea of an economic crisis, which was, for instance, in Greece, in the economic crisis in the 2012, 2011, 2012, it was called in the Greek press the collapse of bread and salt. The idea that this sort of fundamental condition, going back to the German tradition as well, was no longer available, was no longer accessible to large parts of the population. And she has mapped these histories in this extraordinary installation, which you see a little bit here and here, the two sides of this sail, which represents the wind that brought the salt from one place to another across the Mediterranean. And then these elements which you can maybe see more, which we'll see more closely. For instance, these rather, what appear in this image, rather insignificant images. It's not working there. These images here, which we'll look at later, because what happens to this story, and I can talk endlessly about this work, so I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to also sort of allow you to see some of the images of how this installation developed. So here it is in the Greek school, a school which was abandoned because of the expulsion of the Greek population in the beginning of the 1960s in Istanbul after the so-called Greek riots, which were also staged riots in the center of the city, in the Pera area of the city. And this school then becomes empty because there are no kids anymore to teach. But it also, because of this disputed history, because of this violent history, it's also hard to reoccupy it. So it's not reoccupied by a Turkish school, but rather it's left abandoned. I'm sure that with the history of partition, this is also familiar very much to territories here. So these territories are abandoned until contemporary art and the international global art scene comes along and says, we can take advantage of this, because the claim of neutrality in art allows the occupation of these territories, which are disputed otherwise in terms of their ownership, in terms of their history, in terms of refusing to recognize, or in terms of wanting to recognize, because both lead to the rejection of this building. No, to want to recognize it is to say the Greeks should come back, we should leave it untouched. To refuse to recognize is to say it doesn't exist as a building, so we will not take account of it. So these questions of the movement around the Mediterranean, which are also represented in this movement between the exchange of population in the 1920s and then the later expulsions of Greeks who had remained in Istanbul, is something that is also encoded into this installation and this place. So rather like we could say the imperial ghosts, which are called up by Vivan in his installation in Calcutta. Here we have the ghosts of a modern project for Turkey, the modern project of a nation state, called up in this summoning of the idea of salt as something which flows through our hands, but also flows through our economy and flows through our politics. And this flowingness is something that you can see. As you can see, I can start talking about this for too long, and we can get into it. But I was thinking about this question of installation. I would call this clearly an installation. This is something which responds exactly to those places, and I've tried to locate it and ground it within this place, and also to talk about its relations. But when it comes to Van Abbe, this is also called the salt traders. And so this small element, which is, if we look maybe more at the detail, you'll see that there's actually salt. You see black salt, white salt, brown salt in some of the screens, in some of the frames. And also a number of narratives which we can talk about, which reflect some of the narratives that I've indicated to you. That these then become the carriers of this message as a kind of element, a portable element within an installation. And there isn't any more a reference to this installation and to the Greek work. So these become, this is of course partly a market device, no? They're slipping out of their installational aspect. They become part of an autonomous, and we'll come back maybe to the word autonomous in a bit, an autonomous artwork, which is then presented in this way. But nevertheless, this work on its own, in contrast maybe to this, where they become rather marginal elements that are not really seen because of the spectacular nature of the center of the installation and of this sail, which stresses the question of the sort of presence of the movement on the sea. Yeah? The presence of the, you can see in part of this on the right-hand side, there's a ship which is leaning aside of it. And so in this instance, you have something where the small narratives, which are overwhelmed by the installation, suddenly come to life. So these stories, some of which we've talked about salaries and the salarium, about the question of the Ottoman Empire and its monopoly of salt at a certain time, that all these elements come into play in a much stronger way, in a certain sense, with this division. So not only is it responding to the market, it's also allowing the installation to grow. Now, is this an installation or not? I don't know. I don't think it is, to be honest. But I think it grows from an installation, so it clearly has a relationship to installation. And then a year after, it was presented in Tate St. Ives, which is a small provincial branch of the Tate, controlled from London, but located in the far west of the English countryside. And here you see that there are different elements. Here you see the boat more clearly, but you see that the frames have had, given the space and given the type of installation, again have a very different kind of relationship, I think, to the narratives that we're talking about. Here is very much a white cube. Here is the Tate. The Tate, a place which is built on sugar plantations, on exploitation of the workers in those plantations in order to produce the profits that produced the sugar. Now, sugar and salt are not unrelated, I would say, as these commodities that are sort of fundamental for taste, sour and sweet. We talk about that all the time. Indian food is full of these combinations, and so we need both. So this process of the Tate, completely not acknowledging now in its white cube, in its space apart, in its isolated space, not acknowledging this relationship between the salt and the sugar in a way which the Greek school absolutely acknowledged the site in which the work was produced. But this is then more of an installation than this. So, and yet less of an installation, I would say, because it denies, and the Tate of course continues more or less to deny this history even today, but it denies this history of the materiality on which coloniality is built, and the materiality of these materials. How am I doing for time? I think I'm going too slow, I think. I'm going to move on to Sheela Gowda, more to show you this work, actually, because I think that some of the similar arguments apply to the arguments that we're talking about. So this is a work which is rather unknown, I think, although I was very pleased to hear that Geeta had seen some images of it and rather liked it when we were talking earlier this week. But this is a work which was shown on the ground floor, which is significant, I'll show you in a minute, of the Niemeyer Pavilion in São Paulo. So maybe rather than place Sheela and her work, which I wouldn't presume to do here, most of you can do it much better than me, but I would think about its location in this Niemeyer building, this representation of what was called, or part of, the Brazilian modernist movement, also called tropicalismo. This idea was called tropical modernism, which had its potential from the 1950s, and Niemeyer lived actually until he died in 2013. So this was the first exhibition in this space which did not have Niemeyer as a living figure. We could say a living relic by then. He was about 100, but nevertheless a living figure, sort of overseeing, in a certain sense, even if it's only spiritually and in metaphor, the installations in his own work. So somehow there was a strange sense of liberation in doing this exhibition because Niemeyer was no longer here, and I think it's something that Sheela takes very seriously in this work. What she did with this work was work with initially with the question of rubber and the extraction of rubber. So, as we know, rubber is extracted from trees, and it was the driver of Brazil's economy, more or less, in the late 19th century. What was happening is, particularly in the Amazon, particularly in those territories which are very fragile, we know about that fragility through climate change more so now, but at the time they were seen as a kind of endless resource. To a large extent, they still are seen as an endless resource by the people who are controlling the territory, not by the people who live there. But it has disastrous effects, this rubber, tapping both for the forest and for the indigenous populations who were being moved on, who were being murdered effectively, as again they still are, in these territories. What's interesting is at a certain point rubber gets exported, both here and also to Southeast Asia, and the rubber plantations start to replace the rubber that's produced in Brazil. You can see the colonial links that we can maybe speak about later on. And also there was synthetic rubber that came along in the 1960s. So eventually rubber prices plummeted, and the locals who had adjusted to some degree, often they were people who had arrived from the Portuguese and Italian and various European occupations of the territory of what's called Brazil. But nevertheless, as this process happened, those workers in the rubber plantations no longer had the regular employment that rubber offered, so therefore started to go on not only killing sprees for fun to some extent with indigenous people, but also to start to occupy more and more land, start to think about other uses for the land, including cattle farming, which is completely disastrous in these areas, and which means that the trees themselves, which had produced the bounty, were then cut down, and the territories were reduced to empty plains. So this is a work which is called Those of Whom, and it's something where she worked with the rubber tappers in Acre, which is the state furthest to the west in Brazil, and used the rubber, and maybe we can see the installation a little bit more to see this, and used the rubber as the linking element. You can see some elements of the rubber in the installation itself. I'll show you another image. I want to come back to that one. Maybe this one is the best. You can see this yellow material is actually rubber sheets, no, which are still produced from the rubber. There's still some rubber production which is going on. And talking about not only the specific qualities of the rubber which emerges here, but also this whole question of production is aligned with, in a way, the detritus, the abjectness, you know, of certain materials which she found in the markets and even in the dumps in São Paulo. So you can see here, for instance, I hope you can see this. This is a sort of pile of chairs, basically, metal chairs that are mounted up. So you have this sort of metallic element combining with the rubber in quite fascinating conditions. But if we look here, particularly at this image, which is also an image that you see because you would walk past the installation in order to go into the rest of the exhibition. This was in the entrance. This was in a way not quite the first piece, but the first piece that was in the exhibition proper after the introduction. It almost disappears. The installation then gives way to the architecture itself, just as the dominance of a kind of modernist discourse gives way to these questions of materiality, which are written in to the experience of the workers who are producing these materials. So this constant shifting, and I could show you many, many images of the installation as you move around it, as you shape your body in relationship to the installation. They're constantly offering new vistas of this idea of the abject, but the abject not as a kind of psychological condition, not as a condition which it would have been in the 1990s in America, for instance, a Mike Kelly, but really the abject as something that's riddled with coloniality and modernity, as it, which is the detritus of the discourses, the detrituses of the ideologies which we're trying to escape and to get away from. This is where the abjectness of this installation with these objects that you can see, which have been discarded, which have been thrown away, this abjectness is somehow redolent of the materiality of the histories that have produced it, rather than the subjectivities that are in the abject works, famously in the United States. You know, the childhood traumas that are written into them, or the psychology that is written into those. So this is a very different kind of abjectness, something that I find to be very important, because I don't think the Americans would have been capable of understanding, even though they are also a colonizing discourse. But they didn't, certainly in the 90s, have the recognition of the abject as being riddled with these narratives of history, which are part of this work, and also, I would say, part of the SALT work from Anna Boghiguian. Here's another image close up, which maybe, again, gives you some idea. And you can see in the distance, and I just want to recognize this because I saw this image and I thought I can't let it pass, the other Indian artist in the exhibition, which was Prabhakar Pachpute, who was made a significant intervention, which I want to show you here. So the reason I want to talk about this is that, of course, what happens in an exhibition, and here we're moving over in a way from the artistic position to the curatorial position, what happens is that this work is, in some ways, a work a world in itself, no? If we think about this idea of the artist, something that Boris Groys talks about in relation to installation, the artist is a kind of sovereign, occupier of space who then invites people in, but invites people in on their terms. Even if they are a democrat in their name, they impose democracy through an authoritarian gesture of conquering the space. I'm quite dubious about that, and we might come back on it. But you could say that this space of Sheela is somehow a space of her orchestration, not at least. But within a biennale, within any group show, of course, it's also in dialogue. It's in dialogue with other materials. And here, for instance, it's in dialogue with a number of works, and also in the curatorial task is to think about those dialogues and see them as having some sort of purpose, some sort of intelligence. Otherwise, you're simply just lining things up in an art fair, which does not have that kind of thinking. So here, beyond that, is the Pachpute work, which you see extends the whole height of the building. And again, I'm not sure how well these works are known here, so I thought it would again be interesting to show. And this is called Dark Clouds of the Future, which somehow, in an exhibition that actually was much more concerned, I would say, with the question of memory and the question of how to remember and what to remember. This was one of the few works that tried to at least locate an idea. I often saw it as a kind of past, present, future as well, this sort of division of time, which is written in a triad. This process is written into this drawing. Again, I'm not going to go too much into it, but just wanting to say that there's a discussion which is going on. And then if we look right back here, this one, on the behind the translucent rubber sheet that you see on the far right of the image is a work by Qiu Zhijie, a Chinese artist. A quite extraordinary work, I think, which he hand drew. He spent 2 weeks, while everybody else was trying to enjoy themselves in the installation, he spent 2 weeks working more or less 15 hours a day, occasionally working with assistants, but they were never good enough, so they only lasted about a few hours, and then he would go back to doing it himself. Hand drawing these. Again, the image is not perfectly assigned, but what you have here is a world, is a map of a world a world that's made up of territories which he is defining for himself, territories which recognize the Chinese condition of both being a colonized and colonizing state. Territories that, I'm trying to think of some examples, but I can't immediately call them to mind. I don't think you can see them here. But if you look up Qiu Zhijie in online, you'll see many of these maps where there are kind of fictitious narratives, a bit like a sort of Jonathan Swift drawing of a set of territories around Lilliput. The idea that the map itself can be fictionalized, that it doesn't have to allow itself only to be a map that's true or that's a rewriting or that's a particular projection of the world. The arguments about the Peters projection or whatever become irrelevant here as he draws these fictitious maps that contain many of the conditions of the current world. So, for instance, there's a map which looks at Chinese history and the different paths that Chinese history has taken. There's a map which talks about his own biography and talks about his life from childhood to having a daughter and developing his practice in art. So this was a kind of mapping which is traditional in a big biennale, that you get the guidebook and there's a map which you see. And this was a map, a fictional map that introduced the exhibition and sort of led you to Sheela's work. So you were already in this place where a certain reflection on what map making meant allowed you to start to see the materiality of the exhibition and hopefully also relate to Pachput's installation. Again, in this sort of series of affinities which are really stretched out, as an exhibition can do, which are ambiguous, which are ambivalent in how they might come together, but in a sense allow the space of the imagination of the viewer to occupy them, allow the connections which might be made to be made by the subject rather than be made only by the curator or the artist themselves. So very much not a sovereign space. And I wanted to talk quickly about Qiu Zhijie again, just to give you some example. This is an exhibition that we did a little bit earlier a little bit later in Van Abbe, but it stems earlier. And it's about the condition of suicide of the Nanjing River Bridge over the Yangtze, which is the most, well, let's say, the most popular place for suicide in China, essentially. And it's a place which has a huge history of the relation to the modernization condition of the Communist Party of China and its forceful modernization, a kind of late Stalinist version of modernization, as we know, that then produces this condition of alienation, which necessarily, and his argument in a way, is that its history, its materiality, its steel and its incompatibility with the environment produce the conditions in which suicide seems to be an appropriate choice in this place. It's not only that it's about jumping off the bridge, because there are many bridges in China, as you can imagine, as there are many other things that you could jump off. But somehow this becomes a ritual place in which jumping off becomes a recognition of giving up or refusing the conditions, the ideology which the river bridge projects. And I've got a little quote from Qiu Zhijie, which I hope sort of illustrates a little bit of this question. This is him. Nanjing Yangtze River Bridge project diverted my attention to suicidology. I've never heard of that as a study, but I'm sure it exists. In the bridge, I felt first the futuristic and idealist utopian burn everyday life, the integrated collective willpower and coercion from the individuals left behind. However, I find that it is a boiling success and development. This is translated from the Chinese, so forgive me. However, I feel that it is a boiling success and development in the hustle and bustle of the times that really forces a man to suicide rather than disease, the poverty from falling out of love, so that the expected Beijing exhibition, or the expected exhibition, points to the process of industrialization and modernization, pointing to a kind of fanaticism to construct huge monsters. The cheap and plain bamboo, you can see these elements here. There's one here where you can see the figure of the legs diving into the water, so the bamboo sort of representing the water in a way, this weaving. The cheap and plain bamboo was once a symbolic medium and spiritual model of ancient Chinese literati, instead of the personification metaphors of open-minded, faithful integrity, toughness. These are keywords within a communist discourse. I focus on another symbol with biological characteristics. It grows fast, its fecundity is strong, and its powerful underground rhizomes endlessly, this is a plant that grows nearby, its powerful underground rhizomes endlessly spread around, rushing out of the way, but nothing collapses. I do not believe in the immortal, but I believe in the infinite. No rest, no sighing, no interest, no collapsing, endlessly tossing. And that's in a way his understanding, and as I say, it has the sort of the aspects of a translation from Chinese which make it slightly opaque, but nevertheless I think in its poetry of endlessly tossing it's actually quite useful. I think that it recognizes these elements while being quite clear about the huge monsters which modernization conjures up and therefore produces this condition. Now, of course, we can say, and I'm not in any way proposing that the Nanjing River Bridge should be removed. It wouldn't make much sense. But it also doesn't make sense to celebrate it. It's actually on one of the Yuan notes, to celebrate it uncritically, to understand that its conditions has produced also this social consequence, this social consequence in which it is a place, very interestingly, in which people go to die. They go to die in the symbol of Chinese modernization. So what does that say about our relationship between these histories? This is again another project. You can see in the background images of the river itself, and here you see some of the certificates. And one of the most common reasons for suicide, particularly amongst young people, is the failure to get the educational certificate. So that's one of the reasons. And people will travel from very far away. I mean, the trains are fast in China now, but nevertheless, from very far away, from Beijing, from Shanghai, from the interior to the west, will travel to Nanjing in order to jump off this bridge. So it's not that it's a coincidence that this is a place where these things happen, and they often leave little messages written in blood, quite often, on the barrier which they have to climb over in order to jump. So also there's a ritual which is associated with this death, which I think becomes extremely interesting. So what does this have to do? How am I doing for time, Geeta? Can you? Huh? Okay. How long do I have? No. Oh yeah. No, that should be okay. I'm going to touch on a few things, but I'll go a little bit quicker. So what I've tried to sketch out in the installation is this constant way in which these installations, when they're at their most effective, are relational. Oh, and relational and relationality are things that I mentioned at the beginning that very much belong to my understanding of the way that the decolonial thinks about its understanding of the world and of the trajectories which have led us to the point in which we are. So relationality and the installation share an idea of building relation with site, with situation, with object, with time. Latika mentioned some of the modes of installation which we might think about also in the jury when she made her introductory remarks. And in a sense, that's also what I'm doing here, saying that this is the possibility which the installation offers, which is not the autonomous object of art, which is traditionally understood as the product in which art might take place. But it's also recognizing, and I hope you can see this from the movements of the work that we've talked about, particularly in Anna Boghiguian's work, that it is a place which allows positionality, where you're speaking from is allowed into the installation, just simply the architecture itself we've talked about, but also the social conditions in which that work is located. It can be moved, but it then requires to be reconnected, to be, in decolonial thinking, delinked and relinked back into a condition which it adopts. And that's indeed what the Tate installation, I would suggest, fails to do. It fails to relink while offering many, many hooks which could be grabbed, but are not grabbed because of the particularly Western or Northwest European, if London is in Northwest Europe anymore, but the European model of the white cube of the autonomous space in which those links are not sought, in which those hooks are not sought, in which those connections are denied. No, and it also allows memory, or the idea of remembering, yeah, of the member, which again brings us back to materiality. The member being reinstalled, being recalled, being brought back. This idea of materiality, which is in the word remembering, of putting something that has been fragmented back together, of reconditioning its relation with each other, which remembering encodes. And this is in a way what Anna, or what Sheela does in Sheela's work, remembering the history of rubber, which would otherwise not be recalled in the process of simply seeing the material. No, by remembering, by bringing it back into relation with other members, we allow this possibility to emerge. So this is how I see and make the bridge between the installative or the installational and the decolonial. And this relationality is important to understand not as a smooth process, not as a process that is without its fraughtness, without its fragility, but it's also necessary for some kind of common existence. Now, of course, we can follow the extreme neoliberal American route of understanding ourselves only as individuals. There is no such thing as society, is what the neoliberal claim is, no? That we simply exist as individuals. And therefore, relation is not needed. No, relation is only one of exploitation, of mutual exploitation perhaps, but mostly of singular exploitation. So this is the picture which we're given, certainly in Northwest Europe, of how our conduct towards common existence might be. It's look after yourself, and by looking after yourself, you somehow, in some magical neoliberal transformation, also look after other people. But don't in any way think about common existence, because then you're interfering with your own interest, which is what would provide the means for some sort of collective. Now, that's the way that the collective is constructed. Ignore it, and it will somehow survive. If you tend to it, you will destroy it. That's the neoliberal message. And I think what we see in the conditions of relationality as we built within the installation is the possibility, at least, for another image to emerge. I think in Sheela and Anna's and also Qiu's work, we see a different kind of relationality, not only emerging, they've been there in installation from the beginning, but these are examples to understand nothing original. I don't think it's an original claim, but it's a claim that I think is necessary to make if we think about what the value of installation might be in current conditions, what it might offer as a resistance, as a stepping, as a standing against the conditions that are imposed onto us by the ideology. And also the building through positionality of relationality. In other words, what I started with, that if I can have a relationship with you, it has to be because I position myself. Yeah, that's the only way in which that relation can emerge, because otherwise we either search for some kind of common ground without defining where we are standing, which seems to me to be an absurdity, or we end up one imposing the understanding of the world on the other. And that imposition can be an intellectual imposition, it can be an economic position, it can be a political position, imposition, whatever. But this imposition ends up, if there's not a sense of positionality, of standing firmly on the ground in order to reach out, to connect with somewhere else. And this also brings us back to, I suppose, one of the key terms that we understand from within decolonial thinking, which comes from the Zapatistas, which is that how do we build a world in which many worlds fit? In other words, how do we allow ourselves to stand next to each other? How do we, in a world of equality, recognize difference? And this is, I think, the core to some of the learnings that we've had, particularly from the Zapatistas, who also talk about this equality and difference, that has become, very important to my thinking and my thinking around these relationships. And also a relationality, of course, which extends to the more than human, which allows the idea of relation to place to be relationship to those things that are not only human society, which is extremely important. And therefore, by relating to the more than human, I thought it was interesting, we were just outside and we saw a bunch of monkeys, which is the first time I've seen monkeys in the IIC grounds, and I'd hoped they'd come for the lecture, actually, but they didn't turn up, unfortunately. But it sort of reminded me of this question, that how would we allow the monkeys to have a place here? Because they felt also quite aggressive, I think you'd say, Nancy, so I'm not sure they'd be too happy in joining us. But nevertheless, what would it mean to be able to construct those kinds of dialogues? And I think from a position of a positioned relation with place, then those things maybe aren't quite as absurd as they might seem to us today in this room. How would that dialogue actually be opened up? And of course, once you ask that, then everything has to change in order to make it possible. And that change is indeed the challenge that we are at. So this question of relation and installation brings me, in my final talk, more to my own practice a little bit in relation to the curatorial and in relation to the museum. And this is now, I'm heading towards the end, Latika, I hope that's okay. And bringing me to thinking about this relation between the curatorial and the artistic. And I want to interrogate in a little bit, to some extent, or at least to open the discussion about one of the few texts that has been written about installation in a way that has marked a real sort of attempt to abstract the position. So not about specific installations. Many of the people in this room, including Geeta, have written extensively about the question of installation, addressing specific installations, and I think that's the only way in which we can start to speak. But there are some, and Boris Groys is one of them, who want to try and generalize from those positions. And that has its strengths and its weaknesses at the same time, and we can both criticize it and respect it. But it's interesting the way that he configures this generalization. I want to read a little bit of a text. It's only short. He talks about the question of freedom, and he defines freedom also very close to autonomy, which we could imagine, artistic autonomy that he talks about. So if we can understand this question of freedom and autonomy as being closely related, it doesn't mention it in this text, but it's elsewhere in this essay. The artist and curator embody these two different kinds of freedom in a very conspicuous manner. So this idea of having a space, a sovereign space in which you can construct dialogues within yourself. What I was talking about with Sheela's space within the Biennale, that is then confined with relations between Qiu Zhijie, for instance, and Prabhakar Pachpute. The artist and the curator embody these two different kinds of freedom in a very conspicuous manner. The sovereign, unconditional, publicly irresponsible freedom of art making, the publicly irresponsible freedom of art making, and the institutional, conditional, publicly responsible freedom of curatorship. And this means that the art installation, in which the act of art production coincides with the act of art presentation, and the work does not really exist beyond the installation, although we've seen examples where that's not true, such as Anna Boghiguian. And that means that the art installation, in which the act of art production coincides with the act of art presentation, becomes a perfect experimental terrain to reveal and explore the ambiguity of the Western notion of freedom. The ambiguity that lies at the core of this notion of freedom. And what he talks about there is that this freedom is imposed by the artist. The condition of freedom which is given to the artist is something which then he imposes in the installation on the space and then invites people in to share that freedom. In some sense, there is always a hierarchical relationship there. And also, he's saying to some extent that the curators, but he's saying that curator is publicly responsible and the artist is publicly irresponsible. And this feels to me, this was written about 10 or 12 years ago, but it feels to me quite, I don't want to say dated, because that's mean, I think, because all our opinions are dated once they get old. But it also that it feels to me that it's inadequate to the condition we are at the moment. It both doesn't problematize enough, I would say, the ambiguity of artistic autonomy in relation to political autonomy. Oh, because artistic autonomy is something which, until recently, I would say, we won't talk about Dutch politics, but until recently was recognized in the Netherlands, was always, in a sense, a construction of a playground, a territory in which anything can happen as long as it had absolutely no consequences outside of itself. So artistic autonomy was a device which also isolated art from a conversation with the rest of the world. So if we have this autonomous space, as Boris Gross would talk about the installation, we also say in a hidden discourse behind that is that, and also that space has no relation with the world beyond it. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true because I think that not only within the exhibition, which we've talked about, in which a world in which many worlds fit, allow an autonomy to be in relation with another autonomy. And the political autonomy, which is of course the position that the Zapatistas would occupy, is something which is far more likely to tread on the toes of those who don't want or who demand political autonomy, the nation state, let's say it boldly. That the demand for autonomy is not necessarily the reproduction of a new nation state, but is much more, at least in the Zapatista, at least also in Rojava, in the demands of Abdullah Öcalan in the Kurdish area, is the demand for a space in which the communal can have its own position, its own respect. And the communal, I know communal has another meaning here, but the communal in the sense of the commons, of coming together, no? That the communal has a possibility to be expressed within the concept of autonomy. And of course, the communal in a way is a denial of individual autonomy at the same time. And also, this is the striving of a political autonomy, which the artistic autonomy, I don't think, of the installation recognizes. And I think that the installations which we're referring to are not autonomous in the way in which he talks about. And at the same time, it is also in danger in saying that the curator is publicly responsible. It becomes very close to saying that the curator is a service provider. And I think that this idea of the service provider, and I know this from my own bureaucratic existence, the idea of a service provider is something that is absolutely being imposed upon the Western institutions in which I work at the moment. That service providership is coming from the left, with the idea of what they call social inclusion, which is a horrific concept of including everybody in the Western narrative, essentially a colonial gesture once again reaffirmed through the idea of inclusion, or coming through the relationship to the market. Get out and earn your own money. Oh, and you're a service provider to the public by negotiating with the super wealthy in order to construct a dialogue that they would approve of. No? Now, of course, those negotiations have to happen. Of course, my job, an artist's job, is not to be in cloud cuckoo land in which these relationships do not exist. But at the same time, by defining the artist as being only publicly responsible and making that the distinction between the artist, you then place all the burden on this service provider ship, rather than the burden on the possibility of the curator. And of course, I'm defending a little bit my own field here. You know, the possibility of the curatorial to open up a discourse with all the ambiguities that I pointed out before in the Biennale, in which a map of the world and a map of the condition of rubber can have a dialogue with each other, in which rubber and the fiction of the world and the reality of rubber, in which the reality of the map and the strange and the familiarity of the map and the strangeness of Sheela Gowda's installation aesthetically can meet and talk to each other. That for a public can be something in which the strange and the close, the familiar, can come into discourse, into discussion. And I don't think that's being a service provider. It's providing, in a sense, a set of problems for the viewer rather than a set of solutions. And the service provider, also the designer, if you like, is somebody who's driven to a solutional approach. What I want to do, I'm worried about time. 5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to go very quickly because I want to show you a few images just of some of the practice in Van Abbe to try and see this. And we're going to go very quickly through this, which I think is an interesting example, and Geeta encouraged me also to talk about it, an interesting example of a kind of curatorial dialogue, actually a posthumous curatorial dialogue, which is set up between two, essentially we could say Soviet artists, though one is born before the Soviet Union and the other dies after the end of the Soviet Union, only very recently. Lissitsky, which is in our collection, inherited from the 1960s, a collection which of course has many problems that we could unpack maybe in discussion, and Kabakov, who is now in the collection more or less in equal weight to Lissitsky, but at the time of this exhibition was completely absent from the exhibition. The exhibition itself is called Utopia and Reality, and really confronts the hope of the Soviet Union in its early days with the destruction of the Soviet Union in its later days, and constructs them quite directly. You can see this not only in the biographies that are here, but for instance in this little juxtaposition, and I won't talk too much about this, but here you have two monuments. I'll show you the other one here, Monument to a Leader. This is Lissitsky's design for a podium on which Lenin could make his speeches with his famous gesture, which is still in Lodi Park. I saw there's still a Lenin statue in Lodi Park, which is very nice to see in some ways, but also, we have our questions about it these days. But nevertheless, he's actually has his hand in his pocket in this case, but he still has his gesture up. So during his life, this gesture was meant to happen on this podium. And here you see in the background, or maybe here it's better, the monument to a tyrant. Which is very beautiful because here it is somebody who looks vaguely like Stalin, but could be more or less any one of the Politburo around that time, who steps down from his socle, what do you say, the plinth, steps down from his plinth and reaches his hands out a bit like a kind of vampire coming to find you. And you see this in this sort of direct juxtaposition. You start to see a kind of playfulness which is uncovered. Here, on the right, you see the plan for the Wolkenbügel. It's like the skyscraper, which is a model that Lissitsky came up for a whole series of modernist accommodation, which would ring ring Moscow, be built all the way around Moscow. These huge towers which had a T shape essentially, and in the other corner you have a Kabakov installation in which these tiny elements that are found in the communalka, in the communal flats, are then collected and then strung at around about chest height for a normal Western European. So therefore something in which you have to actually bend down and climb underneath, while at the same time looking at the descriptions, because there are little labels that describe them. So you see this sort of the everydayness, the utopia of the everyday, this projection of an apartment block which would be in all its utopian ambition, never realized, and the condition of the everyday, which ended up with the collection of these tiny bits of abject scrap. Again, abjectness is part of this work, and all of that loading within a sort of historical understanding of abjectness. And here we have the sort of ambition that you can see here again, the 5-pointed star, the socialist star here, but also forming the figure of a human, probably a man, we might say, often called the new man. No, this idea that the Soviet Union was to construct a new form of humanity, a new form of capacity of humanity to behave in certain ways. And this becomes this humanity which themselves sort of twists their own form, their own shape, their own physiognomy in order to fit into the ideology. This is kind of how we might read it now. Previously, of course, we would read it as a kind of heroic gesture, but designed for a propaganda exhibition in Germany, alongside all the other propagandas also of the other countries, called the Prensa exhibition in Köln in the 1920s. And then behind it, you have this actually sort of homemade train carriage, which says the bright, in Dutch it says the bright future is behind. Oh no, it says it in English as well. The bright future is behind us. And inside this, you see this carriage, you have this painting at the end, and these two speakers on either side, which blast out kind of uplifting socialist songs from the 20s and 30s. So in a way, Kabakov responding directly to the oral environment in which Lissitsky himself was brought up. And what you have here is a painting which is called "Let's Go Girls." And again, I'm sorry I don't have a detail of it. I hope the projection will be able to show it. But what you see here is a painting of quite elderly women who are sort of gathered in a garden, having a relatively peaceful tea. And this sort of condition is then contrasted, made tense by this sort of youthful music of revolutionary ambition, and the idea, and in the title of "Let's Go Girls" is okay. Now we're going to conquer the world, but somehow the installation itself defeats itself. The image making defeats that. And we were also working with performance to try and sort of animate the exhibition. I won't talk too much about it, but here you see the new men of Lissitsky's Victory Over the Sun opera that come out of off their plinths and become alive within the installation space. And again, constructing it. It's interesting, when we showed the exhibition in Moscow, there was even more of a kind of installational moment in which you see, in the left-hand picture, you see the famous red wedge, which is an image of the red wedge beating back the whites during the Civil War. In the early 20s, made by Lissitsky, and there's a hole in the middle of it. I hope you can see that. And crashing down to earth is the angel, which is the Kabakov angel, which comes down. Again, these nice dialogues which were set up. This wasn't. So I'm not sure I would have done this, I have to say, because it's sometimes a little literal. But it also indicates how in Moscow the exhibition was received and understood. So also in a certain nostalgia in the idea of the angel that crashes to earth, a sort of idea that there was a potential, which I think in the West was never really recognized in the exhibition. Also, in our exhibition, one of the problems, and I talked a lot to Ilya about this, is the danger that it was simply received as a kind of inevitable fall of communism that was going to happen anyway because we were right and they were wrong. And particularly people of my age and older would sort of understand the Cold War in these, obviously in these binary terms, and then the victory in 1989, 1990 being a victory that was thoroughly justified and proved the end of history, as we know, the whole discourse that emerged in the 1990s of a sort of celebratory neoliberal socialism. This exhibition was also in it, and it's called "The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment," which has been written about very much. But I think within the exhibition, what is interesting, this have always been understood as an installation. I think "The Man Who Flew," and was originally installed in an apartment in Moscow, but has then been extracted from that within an exhibition in which these kind of dialogues took place. What I find interesting in this discussion about installation is this becomes much more of a sculpture. It actually loses its installational character, I think, even though it's understood as an installation within the tradition of Kabakov's own work. But in this dialogue with Lissitsky, the installation becomes the dialogue. And this work this is put together with a three-dimensional rendering of a proun, which is an ideal abstracted space which could exist on paper and as a city plan, which has this sort of infinite scalability in a way. And that existed alongside it. So you had these two works which sort of claimed an installational place, but became, within the context of the exhibition, something else, something which related to each other as rather separate artworks. Finally, to just mention Van Abbe and a little bit about what some of the consequences are, I wanted to show you some images of the architecture. I'm not sure why really now, but I sort of thought it would be interesting that we locate ourselves in the soil in which we are from. And wanted to say that what some of this discussion has produced is an understanding of our history and our heritage, which I think is quite important for us. So this is the cigar factory which produced the profits that Van Abbe later was to invest in a fairly favorable terms with the city council to establish Van Abbe. Interestingly, this happened in 1936, so in the pre and the post-war in Western Europe, there was a relatively strong and trusting relationship between what we could call the oligarchs of the time, the tobacco manufacturer, and the public discourse within the government. So there was a kind of trusting relationship which allowed public institutions, publicly funded institutions, to emerge out of private investment, private philanthropy. And this was definitely Van Abbe, this building, which was extended in 2003, is very much part of it. But this was the building that Van Abbe built in 1936. This part of the history of Van Abbe was not talked about until around 12 years ago. I came about 20 years ago, so it also took me some time to understand these full implications. But this part was simply seen as irrelevant, and indeed his collection was seen as rather embarrassing because it wasn't properly modernist in the traditions that we might have hoped for from the pre-war period. It was more or less what we might call bourgeois painting rather than modernist experimentation of the cubist or futurist or constructivist kind. The Van Abbe himself, even though the museum carries the name, was a kind of ghost in the machine that wasn't really recognized, and where his wealth came from wasn't recognized. But this shows you the relationship, the very direct relationship with Indonesia. This is Henry Van Abbe in the image, and also his family, and a visit from the royalty of Delhi, which was the place in Sumatra in the Dutch colony of the East Indies. Which was the most productive tobacco growing region where the plantations were. These plantations basically, and we've done a lot of research since then, were as close to slavery as it's possible. It was what was called contract labor, but there were even many occasions in which people would leave the plantation and would be hunted down and brought back. So in other words, there was no kind of concept of voluntary work in this. I think that's about it. I'd want to maybe talk a little bit about demodernizing and decolonizing, but I wanted to just end by talking about the museum and what this history has done. So one thing is to acknowledge in an exhibition like this the plantation workers as the progenitors of the museum. Without the plantation workers, there is nothing. And of course, we have very few names of plantation workers even. The interesting thing is that the records of the plantations were at a certain point by the Dutch government. The regulation of the legal status of the plantation workers and the laws that might apply to them was put out to the employers and to the employing companies themselves. In other words, at a certain point, and this happens in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, the Dutch state removes itself from responsibility for these people who live on its territory and says that responsibility is given to the companies. And the companies then simply didn't, or either destroyed or didn't keep records in a way in which the state might have done. It's quite a contrast to Suriname, where that didn't happen, and there are many more records. But in the Dutch East Indies, in what's now Indonesia, that simply was removed from the state operation and therefore didn't survive in many cases. So we're struggling to go through that, and we're gathering a lot of oral testimony. We see that as part of our job now, oral testimony from Sumatra. We even found plantation workers who worked on Van Abbe plantations, who are now in their 90s. Who could then talk about the condition, but also the stories that they tell. You see, it's incredibly complicated and fascinating, but you see often that the stories that they tell is actually of the violence committed to them by the Chinese overseers who were put in place by the Dutch in order for the Dutch themselves to appear to be the innocent owners who could then distance themselves from the violence that's going on by employing this other ethnicity as the oppressors of the plantation workers themselves. So a lot of a number of the oral testimonies say how the Dutch were quite good and it was the Chinese that were terrible ones. And you understood that this building up of a system of denial was built into the core of this system of production from its very beginning. Denial was built, the possibility of denial was structurally built in. It wasn't something that happened after the event, or we didn't know. We didn't know, of course, being very significant for us in Western Europe. But we didn't know because we structurally refused and organized itself so that we could say we didn't know. This is very interesting. Here is a couple of images of work that we show in the exhibition. Here you see the Wilfredo Lam. What I like to see pushes the Picasso into the background a little bit. So the Picasso, which is one of the jewels of the collection according to its modernist rhetoric, is still there, is still shown. Maybe at one point it will be pushed all the way out of the room, but at this point it's still part of the discourse. But it's centered around the Wilfredo Lam, and in this cabinet here we talk about the relationship between Lam, Césaire, and Picasso himself, and how Lam was his teacher. 1 minute, and maybe I'll end on this. This is an important reference for us. It's two artists and also Marlene Dumas in the background, but there's a triangular relationship here, but I'll talk about the two artists. One is Patricia Kaserhout, who's a Dutch artist, and these are three people still alive and working now. The middle one is Gloria Wekker, who you might have heard about. These three people are representative of the struggle of what's in Dutch is called black migrant and asylum seeker identities. BMB, it's called ZMB, and on the other side is are two images of a set of 5 by Sanja Ivekovic, in which she uses models from the 1990s, but gives them names of female partisan fighters who were killed during the Second World War. And I think for us, it's in a circle where the kids can actually sit on the carpet and be educated. And for us, this was incredibly important to draw these two struggles, the partisan struggle during the Second World War and the struggle for liberation, black liberation, but also anti-racism, together. Because, and I don't know if you know what's going on in Germany at the moment, but the conditions in Germany are appalling, and Ranjit Hoskute, of course, was an early victim of the intolerance of the German discourse to allow any kind of rewriting of those histories of the Holocaust in terms not of an exceptionalism of National Socialism, but a relationship to coloniality and to the colonial systems, the matrix of power, which was built from Columbus and continues today. And I think that's the understanding that this hopefully allows us to express, and to express the horror of National Socialism as in relationship with, again, with its differences and its particularities, in relationship with that much longer history, and therefore understanding never again, not as only never again to a particular armband and a particular song and a particular leader, but never again to the whole of coloniality. And that's, I think, part of our job. Thank you very much.
And vast lecture. No, in the sense that you could speak in detail about the artworks that you wanted to, and then also expand it to what one might call universal evil at the very end. It's an extraordinary itinerary that you took. And what I had written down, I'm afraid, to begin the dialogue with you, is now seeming to be completely churlish. Because I was discussing with, my discussion with you was on the two terms, demodern and decolonial, with which I've had a problem, as you know, and we've expressed that in public in 2017. But so much of what you put into that, so even if I were to continue to be skeptical of that terminology, you have filled it so substantially and so sympathetically and so generously with the actual examples that you give, that this is in some ways only a kind of structure of skepticism which is proven wrong by the examples that you give. And appreciate that greatly, because it might be true for a lot of people in this auditorium, that the terminology used and then the examples you give and the phenomenology that you create within your museum and in your curatorial thinking is far more in sympathy with many positions that we may take in relationship to your terms, demodern and decolonial. But I'll speak a little about what we might have, or I might have, a problem with. We've been in discussion, as I said, since 2017, and recently, before you came for this, in response to this exhibition. As against my preferred vocabulary, your vocabulary and the concepts of decolonial and demodern, and as against that, my preferred vocabulary of decolonization, third world, and post-colonialism, around which I have hopefully raised not dogma, but a polemic within the Indian art critical discourse. I think, Charles, that you're not, as I am not, sympathetic, particularly sympathetic to the term postmodern, except as in, for me, the Frederick Jameson's postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism, 1991, that marked a break and propounded a cultural critique of neoliberal capitalism in its devouring scale. Subsequently, the term postmodernism has frizzled out and become kind of irrelevant and cheap adjective for artworks. You use another hyphenated term, coloniality-modernity. That is a more familiar trope to us, as it spells a historical and narrativized continuity of power into the 20th century and until today, referring to the modern state and its authoritarian inclinations adapted from histories of feudal and imperial power. The discourse on such hyphenated terms by Latin American and Caribbean dissidents goes back, as I'm informed by much that you have suggested to me in references, to the 16th century and from the 18th century onwards in South Asia and Africa. Used today, coloniality-modernity emphasizes the imperative for recursive critiques within cultures of the global South. And here it is useful to mention Walter Mignolo, Argentinian semiotician and philosopher, especially as you, Charles, are writing a book titled Demodernizing Possibility with Mignolo and with Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti, about whom I do not know. Mignolo, for his part, has engaged with Ranajit Guha and Gramsci-inspired subaltern studies discourse in India. This essay that I read was very relevant and very revealing of the continuities and discontinuities, but particularly the possibility of a dialogic notion of the subaltern position between the continents. Absolutely. These discourses are further complicated by similar interrogations in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. We seem to have claimed the right of discussion on the subaltern question from the 70s, but it turns out that there was a dialogic possibility before that, and which is apparently becoming real and tangible today. Mignolo's term that Charles appreciates, the coloniality of power, points to a hard fact in world history, the insinuation of post-colonialist hubris when imperial power has taken over by post-colonial states. In India, for example, caste, class, race, and gender bigotries seeping into new institutional hierarchies allows an imagined post-independence democracy to become authoritarian. The term decolonial and demodern are at the present moment self-critical forms of thinking in the West. Drawn from the discursive platforms within the global South, the challenge re-enters the European public sphere and devises ways of dealing with guilt, reparation, and new forms of reciprocity. I would like, after hearing your lecture, to qualify this hugely and perhaps null it out of my, little presentation. It would be an act of dissembling if I were to claim comradeship with all the ideas I have put forth in this dialogue with Charles. My affiliations are with another kind of historicizing project, my engagement with post-coloniality and modernity, including my lapses in not internalizing subaltern and Dalit interrogations. All this has been argued in similar forums in India, and I hardly need to revisit here. Coming to the theme of the discussion today, for me, the paradigmatic definition of 20th century installation art is provided by Charles himself in his seminal exhibition work of Lissitsky and Emilia and Ilya Kabakov in 2012 and 13. We have seen images. One of the three images Charles provided for the SSAF poster, one was an installation shot, which you showed here, of the Lissitsky and Kabakov exhibition. This was chosen and designed with some participative elan by SSAF. We love doing that. Our designers sort of did a very dynamic, yes. Despite this paradigmatic exhibition about the 20th century avant-garde, Charles does not appreciate the word avant-garde. Instead of seeing this interventionist proposition as a vector released from historical, political, and cultural situations at various times and places in the world, rather than foregrounding disjunctural politics that makes for structural change, he prefers a conjunctural fusion, a temporal narrative recall that leads to collective action from the radical to the humblest level of community benefit, indigenous ecologies, and care-driven aesthetics. I think that is a relatively more recent commitment of yours, but you can say in terms of time, which period.
My DNA is avant-garde. My DNA is avant-garde from where I'm from.
I thought so, because of the Lissitsky-Kabakov proposition is actually sort of boosting the avant-garde into contemporary dialogue with different implications, to my mind. What I would like Charles to consider is the ways in which the long durée of colonial and post-colonial modernity may also already have gained and practiced distributive possibilities. May I say that again? What I like Charles to consider is that the ways in which the long durée of colonial and post-colonial modernity may already also have gained and practiced distributive possibilities, such as to allow other hyphenations with radical action and with transformative indigeneity that changes the syntax and indeed the semiotics of European modernist form. We are, I believe, witness to these radical moves in art practice since the 1960s in Latin America and from the 1980s in South and Southeast Asia. So Charles, some of us will engage with decolonial and demodern in a combative relation to other lineages of critique and intervention. So my proposition here is almost completely demolished by your lecture.
Sorry.
Because
that wasn't the intention.
No, I know it wasn't. But when you actually speak of materiality the way you do, of historical trajectories that meet, and of actual artworks that are located in curatorial practice by you or by others in such ways that the nomenclature that I am using or you're using becomes subordinate to the actual phenomenological experience. And that, I think, is what is proved by this extraordinary lecture that you give. And I think the fact that you so insisted on materiality throughout is for me a very, very happy connection with the way you are curatorially presenting works, and the actual choice that you made was wonderfully impeccable. I just want to end by saying that Boris Groys, who I have read a lot, and who I admire and quote very often, he was completely, I think, wrong in attributing to the curator the position that he did. And to make the artist into some kind of irresponsible child and the curator into a service provider is proved by your lecture today and by many propositions that have come since of what curatorialship in relationship to the artist might mean. And I think that probably is one of the very invigorating discourses in present day art making and art in the making and presenting of art, which in some biennales has been explored wonderfully, sometimes in the documenta, and which could become actually, and has been attempted, I think, in the documenta and some major, particularly well-curated biennales, is that the actual relationship could in fact be would be a kind of co-creation.
Yeah.
And I think, well, I'll end at that because we have. Yes, we'll simultaneously open it up because we are slightly running off. So let's, and Charles can come in at whichever point, unless you want to say something very specific just now, or shall we open it up?
I think we should open it because there's so much to come back on that it would be hard to pick on on one, and I wouldn't want to. Also, I think sometimes what the decolonial provides for me is the possibility that we can use these different semantic structures, which obviously have different references, but we can try and build relationship with each other rather than the traditional academic discourse of trying to eliminate each other. No, so I think that this relationality, which I tried to conjure, also applies to our discussion, in which we try to find relations while still allowing us the space in which something like the post-colonial, which I couldn't recognize, but I can recognize it through you. So I don't have to demand that you use the decolonial or adopt the post-colonial in order for us to have a dialogue. I think that's very important.
I think, yeah.
So once that, and Walter talks about it, Walter Mignolo talks about it sometimes as a kind of option, that the decolonial option, amongst others, and we can understand re-Westernization and de-Westernization, various other options. De-Westernization being the Chinese option, re-Westernization being the United States option. That the decolonial is part of a set of possibilities, and that's where I think potentialities even, which we can discuss and we can find pragmatically sometimes, which is the most appropriate in a particular circumstance, without the sort of headbutting of to some extent. And I don't mean to reduce it to this, but it is to some extent a semiotic question that we're dealing with, or a semantic question.
No, also because I think your lecture in some ways proved that one can agree completely on, for instance, the materiality question and its locational proposition. And the words can be interchanged in many cases. Please, can we have the questions? Gayatri?
Thank you. I have a short question. Thank you for your talk, which I'm sure all of us found very enlightening. One area where you do step out of your the trajectory of materiality is in the description of the Sumatran tobacco pluckers and the kind of slavery in which these in which the entire exercise and the economy was enacted, and you enter into a more, what would we say, a psychological reading of the character of the Chinese or the character of the Dutch laws which protect them. And then you do mention here about the excavation of identities, which is a project that has been initiated by the museum, if I've understood correctly.
Yes, yeah.
I was curious to know what would be the afterlife of that information or the excavation, to whatever extent it is successful. Does it enter into an archive? Is it viewed as a material for future exhibitions? What is its potential as it is recognized today by you?
Yes. And I'm not sure I entirely agree that I leave the materiality behind, because I'm talking about documented processes of ethnic division which were constructed. So these are factual rather than emotional or psychological conditions in which we're trying to read the plantation owners or the Chinese coolies, as they were called, who were this sort of second order. The ethnic divisions were imposed. That's partly why so many Javanese were brought to Sumatra, so that it wasn't indigenous Sumatrans that were working the plantations, but Javanese, and that's something that we can show through the records of the transportation of people. Also, so they wouldn't so easily be able to run away, because they wouldn't have anywhere to run away to. Sumatra was as foreign territory to them as it was to the Dutch. I would sort of defend the fact that I'm still thinking materially, but I think the question is very valid in terms of what does this research lead to, and the simple answer is exhibitions, actually. So what happens is that the museum, in a way, at a certain level, becomes what would be traditional territory of a history museum or a city museum, or even perhaps an ethnographic museum in this subject, by exploring this through documentation and through images. So what we have currently in the roots of the museum, which is the ground floor, we have a whole display which is called Hidden Connections, Verborgen in Dutch, and this looks at the status of the plantation worker and tries to, as I hinted at in the talk, tries to identify, for instance, their identities themselves through this oral history. And that's told by a number of people. Regi Bai, who's a researcher who's been working on this for some 20 years and hasn't really been able to publish because the Dutch have not been interested in it particularly. So this becomes an exhibitionary mode for the public and becomes an archive for us. And the second question is, how do we work with the contemporary situation in Sumatra? And that is really in thinking about the cultures that are there, and that's research which takes time, and then to see what the responsibility might be of a Western museum towards those cultural expressions. Not only necessarily art, but other kinds of cultural expression, which might involve a kind of epistemological restitution in a certain way. I think there's a restitutional aspect to this, in which funding and allowing things to happen, or helping things happen in Delhi and Sumatra on the cultural field, that's the field that we can support, is I think something that's very much in the pipeline, but it's not yet been realized. But we've been setting up those connections in the last years. But that building of relation takes time. Even working with Javanese people, who are the first people that you tend to contact within the Indonesian art scene, is also a set of relations which need to be built between them and the Sumatrans, and then slowly to build that with the Dutch. There are many divisions within Indonesia, just as I'm sure there are here, that I wouldn't like to comment on.
Thank you.
There's a question there.
I just had one question.
Okay, Parul.
This is really regarding the title of your talk, Life of Installation as a Decolonizing Possibility. And I was wondering, you also mentioned just now that you're looking at possibility as potentiality. Mm-hmm. And in a sense that today we are really living in a world today in Global South, in India, where a lot of these terms with a lot of critical, implications are already getting compromised or appropriated by the, authoritarian state. So in such a sense, how does one revisit the term decolonizing, which itself is such a problem?
Well, I mean, I think that I can understand that. So firstly, to go back a little bit to Geeta, I would recognize decolonization as a process that happened after the Second World War, and that's not related to decolonizing. So that's a word that I completely recognize and acknowledge, decolonization. But decolonization was never complete. I think One example that I was going to mention and that we spoke about before is the Declaration of Independence of Indonesia in 1945 by Hatta and Sukarno, which is a three-sentence Declaration of Independence. Indonesia will be independent. Power and other things will be transferred as soon as possible from the Dutch authorities. And I think that for the analysis of coloniality, so much sits in the and other things, the etc., the dan lain-lain in Bahasa Indonesia. This idea that power and other things need to be transferred is precisely where some of the things have gone wrong, because I would say that the solution of the nation state is to some extent the continuation of coloniality. The nation state itself is a modernist construction. So the idea of an emancipation and liberation which leads to a modern nation state also contains the seeds of its own problematics. So I think in that sense, the decolonizing is something which can address these questions, which I don't find in the post-colonial in the same way. And that might be my subjectivity, but I don't, for me, it's important that decolonizing is a verb. It's hard to talk about post-colonizing. What exactly would it mean? Because it describes a condition. It describes a condition of after the colony. Decolonizing is something which is still in process, which is still something which addresses the now, but also addresses the memory of 500 years of solitude, if you like, as I think in the article with Walter and Ranjit Guha that they talk about the 200 years of solitude of India, and Walter responds with the 500 years of solitude of South America in a certain sense. So we have these ideas in which the addressing of that continuity, that long trajectory of coloniality, is something which the decolonial allows us to do, it feels to me. So to take in the question of remembering at the same time as the question of where we can analyze our condition today. So that's what appeals to me about it. That's why I want to stay with the decolonizing, but I'm not imposing that on anyone at all. But I have my reasons for doing it, and I've tried. There's a long conversation to be had, but that's the basis of the sense of why I want to retain it.
Hello, Charles. Thank you for your talk. My question is about sort of a short comment you made, and you said you didn't have time, perhaps, to elaborate on it. You were talking about the UK examples, and you mentioned social exclusion. And I was just wondering if you could just... Inclusion. Inclusion. I was just wondering if you could just elaborate on that in terms of what you meant by how it was, I can't remember what the word you used, but you said it was not a good idea. And I'm paraphrasing you.
Will you give your name so that in our record we'll have?
Hi, my name is Paramjeet.
Hello, Paramjeet. What can I say about inclusion? That's not a complete set of insults. Okay, one of the conditions that we have in the Dutch language, but this is translating it, is the elision of the idea of diversity and inclusion. So what's called, and I think also in the American or Anglo-Saxon discourse, let's call it DIE, the diversity, inclusion, equality or equity, I'm not sure sometimes, but something like that is a sort of reference that's made. I think we have to make a huge distinction between diversity and inclusion here. Inclusion seems to me to be a paradigm in which the included is brought into a narrative, a pre-existing narrative. So let me give an example from my field. The inclusion of artists within the narrative of the Museum of Modern Art is an inclusive move in which the narrative is essentially not touched. I would say even more, and I have talked about this and written about this, that the Alfred Barr description of the Museum of Modern Art's collection, going from 1890 and Van Gogh through to Cubism and abstract art at the end, is actually the exercise of inclusion, is the exercise of maintaining that as the paradigmatic modern explanation of art history, and then beyond that, of other histories, in which other things can be included and added on, but the fundamental narrative is not changed. The fundamental narrative is a narrative written in New York. The ownership of that narrative remains in New York, for the people in New York, but not only for them, for people who argue and talk about it. So this is the problem of inclusion. So social inclusion also can require an inclusion to a set of paradigms, expectations, narratives, which are those of the person who is already included within the narrative, who can already speak. And I think that what diversity allows, and this is partly where I'm talking about the decolonial, about the possibility of building coalition between difference, or affinity between difference, maybe, that construction is something that in the discourse around diversity allows that to happen, and inclusion does not allow that to happen, in my opinion. So that's the distinction that I would want to make, and why I was talking about social inclusion being problematic.
We can have two more questions.
I have a question. Yeah.
So is there an
I have an observation, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charles, for a brilliant talk. I thought it was most
Can you give your name
consuming. Also? My name is Tanmay Bhattacharya. I teach linguistics. You mentioned these two, what I call the organizing metaphors or principles of relationality and positionality. And I was just curious to know if they seem to be not watertight concepts. One flows into the another, because I think you mentioned also time as, building time as part of relationality, but then you also have memory as part of positionality, and memory was nothing but it is building relation with time. So how do you look at the this overlap, sometimes overlap, how do you keep them separate? How can they be efficient in organizing principles to understand the epistemology that comes from the materiality that you have mentioned as your central motive?
And there's a long answer to that. There's also a short answer to that. I mean, I think that the separation of these terms is also a modernist trope, in which separation is one of the main devices of modernity in order to separate, starting with race and going down the way into disciplinary structures. So separation is not something that I'm necessarily looking for. I'm looking for those overlaps. I started in the beginning saying that a curatorial position is something that's often understood as being in between, and in which we're working with the flows of terms that exceed the definitional which you're seeking. I understand that doesn't work in an academic context. I understand the struggle that makes, but I would want to try and allow that excess of meaning in which positionality and relationality would not necessarily be separate terms but could be understood together. But at the same time, I think that positionality is necessary for relationality in a way that's not true the other way around. That there is a need to position yourself in order to start a discourse with somebody else. So there is a temporal aspect to it in which the position has to come first. If I don't position myself from where I am, then I think it's very hard for me to have a dialogue with anybody else, because I'm always going to carry the baggage of the universalizing position that my body represents in Western discourse, which has been imposed through coloniality on many other peoples. Of course, there are other knowledges, there are outsides of that Western discourse, but the Western discourse has centered the European position, and I'm, in my body, represent that position. So without the positioning that I need to go through, there's nothing else. And I think everybody, I think, in many senses, coloniality positions the non-white, male, heterosexual, elderly person in a certain way that's pre-existing. So the positionality is different in our different relations. So but we have to recognize that those two operations are necessary. And then I think at that point, whether memory flows through positionality, which I think it can do, because you draw from the soil, from the roots, from the things that you need to nurture in order to nurture yourself. And at the same time, there is memory and relationality, which is the relationality between me, somebody who was brought up in Britain, and an Indian, would be, intensely significant. No? So yeah, then I think those things can flow through us.
Yeah, you
Oh dear, the last question. The last is the most difficult.
No. Thanks, Charles, for such a wonderful, wide-ranging territory that you covered. I'm going to take, in the spirit of positional relationality, I'm going to try and introduce a little note of caution, also following from what Parul Mukherjee had asked in her question. And I'm going to do it by taking a cue from the material that you presented. And I was very happy to see you invoke the Zapatista ethic of thinking, of looking for worlds within worlds as a way of thinking about difference and relation. For me, a very favorite Zapatista reference is actually the detective novel, and Subcomandante Marcos's literary adventures in the detective form, which always take place in this peculiarly collaborative form between a mountain man from an indigenous mountain man from Mexico, Elias Contreras, and Sherlock Holmes. And together with other people, they solve crimes. And I'm using that to think of coloniality as a scene of crime, which we can understand and recognize, but perhaps also decoloniality is also a possible scene of crime sometimes. Because within the claims of decoloniality, there might lie, at times, a claim towards a certain pristine innocence. And any detective will tell you that when there is a claim to innocence, there must be a crime. And here, what I'm trying to perhaps draw your attention to is the fact that one of the leading decolonial thinkers in this country, a man of the extreme right, called J. Sai Deepak, who's written a book that is called India, that is Bharat, which is a profound exercise in his kind of decolonialization, points to an imagined, pristine, innocent Hindu identity as a marker of what colonialism and coloniality destroys. The endorsement for this book comes from Walter Mignolo. And it comes as a intellectual endorsing another intellectual, saying, yes, this is not the Western academic discourse of either or, but indigenous knowledge of neither nor, which Mignolo, being unaware of the deep embedded hierarchies within this part of the world, presumes in terms of some kind of original innocence, repeating some of the romantic adventures of colonial intellectuals. So I am just suggesting that let us be a little careful when we advocate positions from points of well-intentioned solidarity, but which may end up reinforcing structures that may backfire on us. That's all.
And I mean, I'm not here to defend Walter, though. He's a dear friend and colleague as well. But I recognize also the problematics. Also, if we look at his position in relation to the Ukraine war, we have also disagreements, let's say. But I do think that in his own terms, and those, for instance, of Rolando Vasquez, who I'm even closer to, the question of positionality and relationality, if they were applied here, would force Walter, in this instance, to understand those connections before he would give such a... And of course, these terms can be misused. And of course, there is a way in which the decolonial or the demodern can be seen about a return back to a pre-existing utopia. Yeah? I certainly, in the demodern, and I tried to say it towards the end, see it as a process of going through the remains of modernist or modern culture and trying to understand them for what they exclude and what they might indicate of a relation that we can build with the world as it is, rather than a utopian world of the avant-garde, I'm afraid, which was projected. And also, the interesting thing for me in Lissitsky and Kabakov is that Kabakov is not really an avant-garde artist in my terms, but is an artist who rejects the avant-garde. I know that we all disagree with this, but as
Kabakov, I won't disagree with.
So understanding that, I think we need to understand that the decolonial is a possibility which has its dark side as well. It's not something which is pure white, let's say, to use a very problematic term. But if we use innocence, then we also associate it with certain colors, not unproblematically. So the idea that there are other epistemologies beyond the modern and beyond the Western are, I think, extremely important and core to this. But those epistemologies also need to have their own discourse of criticality, if you like. So the fact that many societies were, in some sense, matriarchal, but many of them also were extremely patriarchal, is something that needs to be considered. Many of the relationships that the colonial authorities used were relationships, and that's true here, were relationships that were pre-existing. The idea of power and the exercise of power, as I understand it, in India was something which suited the colonial condition. These are things that we have to say, but it doesn't mean that we're then stuck within a modernist discourse. It means that we can understand these and I think, I know he's an awkward character, but Gandhi is in some extent trying to extract from those histories something which is usable for his present. And I think that possibility to make use of the remembering in order to put together a different structure and not the same one, not to go back, but to work through the modern, in my case, to work through the modern to try and understand how we can reject it to a certain extent, or at least reshape it. It's not an anti-technological move. It's a move about trying to reshape the narrative so that we understand how we can come into relation. And I think that Walter here probably didn't do the relationality and took the positionality maybe for granted. And that's something that can be done given Walter's output, which is extraordinary and extensive and often, even supersedes Zizek at certain times. That's an issue that we've had discussions about. So I can't defend him on that. I understand your position, but I would still defend the functionality of the decolonial as opposed to the other terms that we've got. And in a sense, like any term, it's there until it's not needed, or it's there until something else comes along. That's better.
Thank you, Charles, for your answers, which were very, very, very specific and pointed and both polemical and very sympathetic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Geeta. Thanks for inviting me again.